Hello, my name is Jung Jae-geun, the president of Daejeon Sejong Research Institute. I'm also serving as the Secretary General of 2022 Daejeon UCL's Organizing Committee, which is in charge of preparing for the 2022 UCL World Congress that is supposed to be held in Daejeon next year. Today, I'd like to present with the topic a new perspective on local autonomy in the post-COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on the new journey of Korean local autonomy towards an inclusive state. It is my great honor and pleasure to deliver this keynote speech at this valuable forum organized by Korea Research Institute for Local Administration and OECD Korea Center. With today's presentation, I'd like to clarify the relationship between local autonomy and inclusiveness, which is a key principle of 2030 Agenda. Particularly, inclusiveness has shown its importance for sustaining our society facing the COVID-19 pandemic. For this, we'll first think over various discourses on the future of humankind that are being discussed through the overcoming process of the pandemic, and those discourses triggered policy issues. Then, I'll show the theory of an inclusive state as a new system for addressing the issues caused by COVID-19. And then, I'll talk about the importance of local autonomy as a political and social philosophy in constructing the inclusive state. Finally, I'll conclude my presentation with several policy recommendations on which Korean local autonomy should focus in the post-corona era. Let me first think about policy issues triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. First, the pandemic requires a paradigm shift from the era of competition and efficiency during neoliberalism over the past several decades to the era of inclusion. Second, the pandemic discourse emphasizes the need for a paradigm shift from human-centered to environment and eco-centered. The argument that the COVID-19 pandemic is caused by climate change and environmental degradation is gaining credibility. As can be seen from Figure 1, the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, lists deforestation, illegal wildlife trade, intensive animal husbandry, and climate change as factors for the increase of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. Therefore, inclusiveness between human and nature is essential. Third, the COVID-19 pandemic has made us rethink the future of cities. Many experts propose the appearance of post-corona cities as an inclusive city that eliminates all inequalities within cities. Fourth, our society needs to cultivate a sense of solidarity and empathy to overcome inequality and hatred. Facing pandemic, we are aware of the importance of the citizenship to influence individual attitude and behavior. As we have been discussed, all issues triggered by pandemic converge on inclusiveness. As you all know well, a key principle of 2030 Agenda for SDGs is inclusiveness expressed by what is leaving no one behind. In this regard, facing COVID-19 pandemic, inclusiveness has been strengthened more the key principle of SDGs. Therefore, I can argue that building inclusive society is to guarantee our sustainable prosperity. Indeed, suffering from the global financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic of 2022, the neoliberalism ideology, which has dominated the planet for decades, is converging into inclusiveness. The inclusive state theory could be a good approach in addressing these issues comprehensively. Acemoglu and Robinson in Why Nations Fail argued that the prosperity and decline of nations depends on the inclusiveness of political and economic institutions. And in the narrow corridor, states, societies, and the fate of liberty, they also argued that the condition of democracy is an exquisite balance of power between a strong state and a strong civil society. Figure 2 was presented by Song Kyung-yoon to examine the development direction of an inclusive state. He defines the inclusive state as a state that grants its citizens the rights and benefits such as citizenship, political participation, employment opportunities and income distribution, and access to public services. As can be seen from Figure 2, the road to an inclusive state is a narrow corridor, as it must satisfy the conditions of freedom and democracy and economic and social prosperity simultaneously. Therefore, two conditions must be met to establish a completely inclusive state. First, it is to establish a state in which freedom and democracy are guaranteed within the narrow corridor of a strong state and a strong civil society. The second condition is to create inclusive institutions that is not politically and economically exclusive or extractive. Now, let's take a look at what local autonomy means. Local autonomy is a local political and administrative system in which local residents serve their own local affairs through their own local government they formed, with their own financial resources based on their own regulations they made. State sovereignty is independent and exclusive to other countries, but local autonomy is determined by the extent of decentralization between the central government and local governments within a country. Local autonomy can be categorized by two dimensions. In Figure 3, the y-axis represents the decentralization and the x-axis represents autonomy capacity. Decentralization is a matter of distribution of powers between the central government and local governments. Furthermore, it is a matter of allocation of functions between two governments, central and local. The axis focuses on autonomy capacity of local government in performing their own work. Autonomy capacity is a matter of how well a local government can perform a given task independently under self-responsibility and without the central government control. Autonomy capacity usually refers to not only internal administrative capacity but also local governance capacity. Figure 4 shows the evaluation design of local autonomy that the Korean government developed. Capacity and participation in the category of local autonomy elements represent autonomy capacity in x-axis of figure 3. Therefore, autonomy capacity should be defined as the sum of the capacity of the local government and the capacities of all the social and economic actors in an area, such as public and private institutions, civil society organizations, corporations, and individuals, plus local government's capacity. Local governance capacity means how well all the governance actors work cooperatively, and it largely depends on the participation of the actors in the decision-making process. On the other hand, there is an argument that emphasizes a local democracy as a principle of local autonomy, substituting local autonomy axis in figure 3 with local democracy axis in figure 5. It implies that autonomy capacity means local democracy and that participation and local governance constitutes the essential components of autonomy capacity. Previously, I've mentioned two conditions for an inclusive state. As mentioned by Esmuglu and Robinson, the exquisite balance of power between a strong state and a strong civil society signifies the condition that local governance capacity is maximized. And local autonomy can truly be a politically inclusive system that accomplishes local democracy through the participation of residents and civil society. Therefore, good local autonomy leads to an inclusive system that balances power and civil society by maximizing its governance capacity. And it also contributes a politically inclusive system by realizing a local democracy by maximizing the participation of residents. In this regard, local autonomy is a core system for building an inclusive state. Theoretically, local autonomy is an essential system to build an inclusive state. However, it is now necessary to prove the effectiveness of local autonomy in the process of responding to the pandemic. It is because we have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic if a particular system cannot successfully tackle pandemics, it will not be an option to take. Let's now examine South Korea's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As of November 2021, it is difficult to judge South Korea's response to COVID-19 as the pandemic is still in progress. But when just comparing the effectiveness of testing, tracking, treatment, and isolation, which are key elements to the pandemic tackling, as well as the cumulative number of confirmed cases and the number of deaths resulting from these activities, Korea's response to COVID-19 as compared with that of other countries can be said to be successful. There are still severe social and economic difficulties, and the blame of delays in vaccination are subject to criticism, and yet it is difficult to undermine the effectiveness and appropriateness of the pandemic response, which has been stably carried out from the beginning until now. 이 시초, after observing the response of Daegu City to the severe pandemic situation from February until April of 2022, where 80% of Korean confirmed cases came from Daegu, designed the network governance model of Figure 6. Employing this model with control and consensus dimensions, he analyzed 4 issues: the relations between the state and individual, the relations between the government and the market, the relations between centralization and decentralization, and the relation between isolation and solidarity. Easter's observation, through the analysis of the 4 issues mentioned previously of South Korea's self-governing capabilities that contributed to K-quarantine, can be summarized as following. First, an appropriate balance between centralization and decentralization. Second, an efficient distribution of functions between the government and the market. Third, a voluntary concession of individual right, the acceptance and trust in the control and intervention of the state in the public sphere. And fourth, the act of civic consciousness demonstrated through the likes of wearing masks, voluntarily restricting movement, and performing voluntary work. Quarantine would have been impossible without the local government's active cooperation and responses, and the influence of local governance in mobilizing and encouraging local communities to cooperate with the governments and all the other governance actors. Therefore, the COVID-19 pandemic has made us recognize the essential role of local governments, not only that of the state, that of the central government. Now, I'd like to present some policy recommendations to develop Korean local autonomy based on what has been learned throughout tackling the COVID-19 pandemic and the perspective of an inclusive state and K-quarantine, respectively. First of all, in terms of inclusive state, Korean local autonomy must strengthen grassroots democracy based on the principle of local autonomy. It could be direct democracy or deliberate democracy to overcome the limit of representative democracy. It makes local autonomy contribute to constructing a politically inclusive system. Second, there must be a transition towards sub-region autonomy, like neighborhood autonomy. Third, in terms of K-quarantine, it is necessary to find an appropriate, non-excessive level of decentralization. I'd like to explain this a bit more because you might be interested in it. International organizations like the World Bank and UNDP often use decentralization as an important criterion in funding developing countries. There is a perception that more decentralization leads to better local autonomy and is more useful for central local governance. However, in Korea, an appropriate balance of centralization and decentralization has contributed to responding to pandemic situations compared with the countries that failed in effective control at the initial stage, despite their advanced decentralization. With this non-excessive decentralization, the central government could demonstrate its leadership to control the whole country and system, and the local government had the appropriate freedom and authority, as well as creativity and diversity to respond quickly to the changing situation. However, therefore, even in decentralization, there must be a governance framework that takes both centralization and decentralization into consideration. First, establishing governance does not mean reducing the functions of the government. The process of finding an appropriate level of functional distribution between the government and the market does not mean weakening the function of the government. Good governance should be one of positive growth that increases the functions of the government while increasing the power of other actors. The government should still play a central role in the governance system. In Korea, the government can make laws and regulations. It also possesses over 1 million personnel and has a budget of more than 500 trillion won. Above all, the government, unlike other governance actors, it is an actor that carries out public values. Therefore, in relation to decentralization and local autonomy, it is important not to sacrifice local government's functions and roles in order to establish local governance. In other words, it is important not to increase the capacity of local governments as well as the capacities of all of the actors of local governance, like individual citizens and socioeconomic entities. Figures 7 and 8 show a comparison of the governance system we should aim for. Finally, decentralization of autonomy should increase civic awareness and autonomy capacity. Important characteristics of K-quarantine is voluntary citizen participation, including citizens' compliance to uncomfortable quarantine rules, such as social distancing, and concession to the government in accessing personal information for the tracking of infection routes. There is no argument in that local autonomy promotes citizen participation and functions as a training ground for grassroots democracy. Therefore, local autonomy in Korea should be in the direction of enhancing civic awareness. Through the discourses related to the paradigm shift brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, we've observed so far that the establishment of an inclusive state is an excellent alternative to a comprehensive approach for problem solving. We've also observed the philosophical and institutional importance of local autonomy in the journey towards an inclusive state. Furthermore, we've also observed the future focus of local autonomy in Korea from the perspective of an inclusive state and from the perspective of K-quarantine. Building an inclusive state is not only for responding to the pandemic, but also realizing SDGs in terms of inclusiveness. Although this presentation focused on the pandemic and Korea's local autonomy, I hope that this delivers insight for the implementation of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you for listening.